Mad windy here today. Mad windy. Yeah, prophecy. Prophecy in space time. Well, first thing I want to say about that is that I believe prophecy is real. Now, I don't believe that any human being has a gift to bring forth prophecy from it themselves. I have seen no proof anyone who could sit there and just because if a person had the gift of prophecy in themselves, they wouldn't need to do what Edgar Casey did, fall into a trance, into a sleep, and so on. They would be able to just say, okay, this will happen next week or next month. So this is why you have to be careful with prophecy. Prophecy is always connected to an entity or a being or a force or a consciousness that you channel or you connect inside you that can tell you the future. In English folk magic traditions, you had the thing of the cunning folk. And the cunning folk used to summon the king of the fairies called Oberon, who's mentioned in A Midsummer's Night Dream. And Oberon, as the king of the fairies, if you look at him, according to the led tradition, he was dressed like a sultan. So he was probably a jinn type thing. But this took place in urban English folk magic. And the Maymine just walked by. And that's not a me calling, that's a Maymine. But the Oberon was probably a jinn kind of thing. And this entity could go in the future and see things and find things, or could travel in space-time and find things that were missing. And this is the purpose of demonology, is you can get messages from the future and get entities, because they are not the same consciousness as we are. They don't have a connection inside their brain through their cognition to lock us into this version of space-time. So therefore they move freely back and forth through space-time. Now, you know that song by Led Zeppelin, I think it's Stairway to Heaven, where it goes, if there's a bustle in your hedgerow or so. That was a belief that comes from Celtic folklore, that a fairy is moving near you, but because they're in a different space-time, they're flying much faster. So they're moving much, much faster in space-time. And all we detect them as is there was a Star Trek episode, I think, about that as well. Like that, because they're in a different space-time. Now, that's also the whole thing in Ireland of Tir na Og, the land of the young, where people go away to Tir na Og or the land of the fairies, another place, in a fairy world, and they come back and they're the same age as when they left, and all their family are dead, and all the grandchildren of their friends are all old people, because time has passed completely different in fairy world than it had in human world. And that's what you also see that in the alien, the whole alien abduction thing, like the Fire in the Sky, Travis Walton. I actually met Travis Walton and spoke to him about this. He's a very nice man, but and sincere. And that alien abduction thing happened in the woods. I mean, it was a classic fairy abduction processed in a cultural sense as an alien abduction, but it really did happen. Now, so this thing of prophecy is what that's about. You don't just have... Edgar Casey was the sleeping prophet. While he slept, he had prophecies of the future. A lot of them came to pass. It's about a trance-like state. You're not going to pull it from in yourself. Another form of consciousness will do that for you. Now, speaking of which, there was a thing in Irish mythology called the Babe's Prophecy. I posted it down below. Now, the Babe is part of the tripartite Morrigan, Maca, Anan, War Morgana, War Goddess, Battle Raven, Crow Goddess archetype, which is very common in the European culture. Anyway, and at the end of the Battle of Mytura, which allegedly took place between the final Battle of Mytura, between the Tuatha Danann and the Fomorians, allegedly 3,500 years ago, at the end of the battle, the Babe makes a prophecy about the future of the world. Now, the Battle of Mytura is very similar to the Battle of Puravashta in the Bhagavad Gita in the Vedic tradition, Although it's probably based on a real battle and real events, the after effect was so traumatic that it's as such became a dialogue between the different poles of cognition and consciousness. And therefore, the discussion between Arjuna and Krishna in the battle of Puravashta in the Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue between the subconscious mind and the cognitive mind, the subconscious and the conscious. As the story and the narrative developed over the centuries, well, the same thing has happened, and very few people in Ireland, unfortunately, have seemed to figure this out yet. Some have, and I'm not the first. That the Battle of Mythura within the legend between the fight between the two of the Danann and the Fomorians represents in the storytelling narrative as the decades passed as a stream of consciousness, a discussion between the subconscious mind, the soul of man, and the consciousness. Now, at the end of the battle, as I says, the Bave makes a prophecy, and the prophecy is stunningly accurate in the world we live today in. It was almost as if at the end of the battle, when the two of the Danann had defeated the Fomorians, it was almost like a metaphor for what I wrote about in my book, The Druid Code, in 2500 BC. Something happened that split human consciousness down the middle all over the world, and we probably lost a level of free association and developed more of a individual ego-based, now I'm not putting down the ego is very important, ego-based outlook on life rather than a collective free association mentality. So therefore, the Babe's prophecy could be seen as a message saying, okay, you've moved away from the Fomorian mind, this, the thing of just survival and war and those things, and you developed a more cultured mind, the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were a mystical fairy kind of thing. Now, elvish, higher, but with that movement away from the collective free association mind and towards that of the individual, personally creative, ego-based, centered mind, you will pay prices for that if you're not careful in the future. And the Babe's prophecy, written from the old Irish, but we only have the early middle Irish version translation. By the way, the Christians translated again much later on and turned it into a thing about Jesus and salvation. But the earliest one is bang on. It's very close, and you can only imagine what the old Irish one must have been like. And the Babe basically says, I will see a world that's not dear to me. It'll be a world where nature and man has become detached from one another, where men have sex with their own sons, where daughters have sex with their own fathers, basically saying that this will be the kind of wages of decadence. See, well, the wages of this, shall we say, Epicurean re-emergence of the human soul following the Battle of Mythura would, if not carefully moderated or looked after, would lead to decadence, and the decadence would involve the ultimate black magic, and that's to have an incestual relationship with a child or have sex with a child. And the Babe 3,500 years ago predicted the world we live in. The world of Desmond is amazing. The world of the paedophile exchange, information exchange, trying to have lobbying the British government to legalise paedophilia, NAMBLA, transgender babies, parents telling their babies that they're not boys, they're actually girls. And so this is the world of the Babe's prophecy, a world that is not dear to me. Now, it's very possible that in the past, a scribe, Christian or pre-Christian Druid, was writing down the story of the Battle of Mythura as a basic historic thing or a mythological thing, this talking about how the Tuatha Dé Danann were defeated by the Fomorians. Now, and then almost channeled an entity that maybe even the Babe itself, that actually brought these prophecies words into the person's skull, and they wrote it down on paper that we know today as the Babe's prophecy. Now, another interesting aspect of this is that the Tuatha Dé Danann were then replaced by the Milesians, Gaels, who were what I am really, the Irish, who are descendants of the ones that came up from Iberia, what Galicia, what we call Spain, Portugal today, and they came to Ireland again to replace, and then the Tuatha De Danann were sequestered to the hills, to they became the She. They became very angry against humanity, but they would return on the day when Ireland is at its lowest point and needs help. So, but there's an interesting sideline to that probably came through that prophecy as well, because if you look at the Gaelic restoration thing in Ireland and the growth of the Gaelic years, Gaelic, the Gaelic League, it happened in the aftermath of the Great Famine. And suddenly, when the Great Famine happened, the Irish people became Gaelic again. And you had the growth of the Gaelic League, which eventually led to the war for independence. So we would never be subjected to a foreign power that would like mismanage the country and millions of Irish people starve again. And so that was a prophecy as well when you think about it. That was a prophecy as well. So this is the thing with prophecy, is that it doesn't come from inside an individual. It comes from an entity or another form of consciousness that has been channeled or brought into the individual making the prophecy. So when someone says to themselves, I'm a great prophet, that's a really that's a form of narcissism, because they're not getting it from inside themselves. They're getting it from a third party who is entering their consciousness and telling them about this. And of course, with this, you can't be actively seeking prophecy, because you're going to get low-level demonic entities who will tell you anything you want to hear. Just like when they're around the Ouija board and they're telling you this, that, and the other about, they will tell you the lies about the future. They'll tell you the lies about the future with the desire for you to make a mistake based on a false prophecy. You see that a lot with a good example of that would be the end time UFO or comet doom cults. A certain date would be selected to say the end of the world, or the space brothers are coming, or the exit into another density or another dimension is coming on a certain time on a certain date. And then they will sit around and they'll predict a year or whatever, or a time for it to happen. And they sit around. There was a book called My Life in Orange about this, and they will sit there waiting for it to come. The cult leader absolutely believing it, as the cult leader said this would happen. Well, it wasn't the cult leader said, it was the entity that was inside them. And as the time hits midnight, or when the thing is going to happen, they begin to release enormous amounts of psychic energy, terror, sheer terror. Because it's a very difficult thing to come to terms that you've wasted your life on this person, that they told you were going to go to another planet and you didn't. Or they all commit mass suicide, and the entity feeds off them at that point of the mass suicide or the terror of the thing not happening. And that's why it planted the prophecy of the spaceship or the whatever, the ascension happening on that date, which brings us really into question, what is fuck is Christianity and the whole thing of Judgment Day? Who's really behind all that? And it doesn't happen. And I think in the book My Life in Orange, what they decided was that they had been spared. Like the cult leader said, oh, well, we've been spared. No need for this anymore. And that's a common one. When prophecies don't come, the cult leader will change it to, well, we're moving naturally into a higher levels of consciousness. We don't need the comets. We don't need the spaceships. We don't need it's a way, and it's a gaslighting. And then because people have invested so much of their lives in this belief, they've locked themselves away in a cult compound or a castle or a big house somewhere, and in a kind of a fantasy world, they can't go back to normal society. So they say, okay, and then the cult from that point on becomes absolutely saturated with demons and demonic activity, but and behavior, and and then that's it. That's basically what goes on. Now, that's what prophecy is. Prophecy is a double-edged sword. It's real, but be wary of the messenger. It's one of those things where you kind of have to kind of be wary of the messenger, and also evaluate it after the prophecy has come true. A prophecy is like it's like they say, it's only hubris when you fail. It's only prophecy when it comes through. Before that, it's not prophecy, it's provisional prophecy. And if it comes true, then you realize that something remarkable has happened, like the Babe's prophecy. If it doesn't come through, then you know you've been duped for energy by the same entities who didn't know whether to tell you the truth or tell you a lie. And that's prophecy. So when anyone calls themselves a great prophet, they're really not a great prophet, they're a great channeler.